Probably many of you experience bad leadership, and often people wonder, what are the consequences? And often people think there are no consequences, but I can promise you they are. Sometimes you don't see them. However, we now have a perfect example of how bad it can be. And we're going to talk about P&O ferries again, but just briefly. P&O ferries, some of you might remember, if you haven't listened to the podcast of the last weeks, P&O ferries is the company where a CEO fired 800 people via a Zoom call. That fired back badly, of course. People either occupied the ships or walked off, and the whole already nearly close to being saved a ferry company now is in complete turmoil. And last weekend, the absolute catastrophe happened. P&O ferries had to announce that all the tickets are voided, they have no staff, they can't run, and any client, please, should use another vendor to go on their trip with or wherever you want to go. That is probably the worst case scenario. I'll say so far it is the worst case scenario for P&O ferries, and still we are waiting for an apology from CEO Peter Hebblethwaite, who still was sitting in the House of Parliament in the UK saying, yes, I broke the law, yes, I knew I broke the law, and I still stand by my decision, and I would do it again. And I unfortunately have to say this is a new quality of leadership misbehavior, that people not only, as it seems so far, deliberately break the law, they consciously break the law, and then they sit in the House of Parliament where laws are decided and they still do not care, which is an open ignorance towards democracy. When you sit in front of lawmakers and you say, I don't care what you decide, I broke these laws deliberately and I don't care, then you are obviously not the right person in a leadership chair or in a leadership position. And that move definitely harmed the whole organization. If we now look into organizations, what happens when you do leadership misdemeanors, misbehavior? You do not act as a good leader should act. So first, you immediately harm the organization reputation, meaning employer branding. And of course, now there are leaders who say, oh, I don't believe in employer branding. We are a regional business. No one cares about that. This is for large corporations. No, it's not. The reputation quickly becomes known on the market, and the recruiting has to do way more effort to get people on board. So you have to spend more on job ads, more on networking, more on any kind of advertising. You have to hire more people at HR. You have to do more interviews, spend more time to get some people in, because more and more people only listen and hear your name and say, I'm not going to work for you because I heard what kind of people you are and I'm not interested in working with you. And the next problem is the people who still want to work with you probably don't care who they work for. And do you want to have people who don't care for whom they work? Or do you want to have people who are simply left over on the job market because no one else wants to hire them, so you have to hire them now? Probably not the quality of people you want to hire. And of course, besides that, you have online platforms. Online sites of internet anonymity. And of course, there are some people who just want to vent, but people can read through these lines and see who wants to vent, who's just aggressive, who is just frustrated about failing at a job and blaming their employer, and which people are there giving very clear reasoning, proper argumentation, proper reasoning, proper arguments, telling people, hey, these are the upsides, but these are many downsides. And when I see the remarks from employing organization, from employers, many of these employers show an appalling reaction and are obviously unable to deal with any kind of criticism. And this behavior, of course, has an impact on your employees that you have right now. People will realize that, will feel seriously uncomfortable. You will then face a higher turnover, and of course you're going to lose, and this is the DIKW principle that you probably know: data, information, knowledge, wisdom. So data gets lost or maybe stolen, taken away. People take it to their next employer. They are not allowed to do so, but you know that they will. Then, of course, the information gathered from the data maybe is with the people, not properly documented, so you lose that as well. The knowledge they have and the experience they have, you lose that as well. And the wisdom, and especially the aspect of experience, because we all know there is no fast forward for experience. You lose all that experience. And of course, now you could claim, hey, there's always an employee turnover. So a bit of loss is always there. And yes, do you have a certain employee turnover that is reasonable? However, you don't have an employee turnover of 30%. because then you lose so much experience that you cannot do proper handovers. You have to retrain people over and over again. Costs for onboarding will go through the roof, and your profit will be minimal, if probably not existent. And all that due to leadership misbehavior. And now we have to see, how can we do it better? So first, when something goes wrong in leadership, you have to act immediately. Unfortunately, that is not the standard. Often people say, hey, it's very stressful. We just went through a pandemic, difficult times. Then we have the inflation now. We have a stressful moment somewhere in a project. Client just complained about X, Y, Z. There's always a reason why something is more important than talking about leadership issues in your organization. And you shouldn't be surprised that when you behave in such way, people do not care anymore to tell you about leadership misbehavior because they simply give up. And when you only have annual appraisal talks, which means you suddenly in December hear about, well, we had a misbehavior case in March, but no one cared. And then you say, well, I don't remember March. It's just too long ago. Well, the main problem is only talking once a year with your employees is simply not enough. You at least have to do it quarterly, better monthly, or you do box stops like they do at Formula One, pit stops like they do at Formula One. And very brief talks where you say, hey, how are you? How are things? How's it going? And you simply talk about what are the ups and downs so you can briefly get an overview. But when you say we have annual talks, that is just not enough. You will find out way too little, way too late, and then you will already have the impact in your organization. Also, leadership is something people learn. It's not something that you just get by being enlightened. Some people have more or less empathy, and that can be an advantage. It is not in every case for every job, but in many cases, there is an advantage for people who show more empathetic behavior. But still, leadership is something you learn. I learned it. Anyone else learned it? Look on my LinkedIn. You see all the courses, Harvard, MIT, etc. And I invested a lot of time and money into it because that is the proper way how to learn it. Because when you do not learn and people only tell you, oh, listen to your people, be a good example, be a leader by example, blah, blah, blah. And that is just leadership folklore. It has nothing to do with properly learning leadership. So it is very important that you learn leadership in a way that can be applied to your real-world practice by experts who also come from real-world practice, but also have the scientific background. And I don't mean that they need to have formal degrees, because we know that some people have great degrees but can't explain anything. People who have the knowledge and the skills and are properly trained to deliver you in due course of training or coaching or whatever else principle or method you choose. Leadership is something you learn. If you do not train your people, the worst thing that can happen is the following. You might have that kind of person who never had a situation of power. So they never had power, they never felt power. Suddenly you have someone with a, let's say, below average degree of formal education. I don't mean degrees, I mean how to deal with leadership and power. So you never taught them how to be a leader. You never taught them how to deal with power. And suddenly you give them both. You tell them you're a leader now and you have power over other people. And then you are surprised that some of them, due to their structure of personality and being completely non-trained on the matter, they misuse it. And that is not surprising at all. It is very important that people are properly trained, and this training has to be constantly updated because leadership evolves. For decades, we had leadership in on-site scenarios. Suddenly, a pandemic hit, and now you have remote leadership where you have to lead people who you hardly ever see. And if you see them, you only see them on a computer screen. And still, the business has to run. It is very important overall that you put the people in the focus of your leadership activity. And I don't want to sound like one of these motivational speakers, it's all about the people, blah, blah, blah. That's not the point here. But what many organizations do, they do profit over people. So you don't treat people well because you think when you don't invest too much in them, you have more profit. But by not treating them well, you have such a high employee turnover, then you harm your employer branding, recruiting, all the costs we talked about that just 5 minutes ago. All these costs appear and you are killing the profit you think you're making, and you're killing double of the amount you could have saved in the first place. So bad leadership behavior, even when you are one of the worst leaders and say profit over people, by not putting people into the focus of your actions, you are harming the profit you think you're generating by doing so. And it's not the most honorable motivation, only changing behaviors due to profit. But at least I know that some leaders now listen to me because they say, oh, when it costs me money, I probably should change. And it's very important that everything you do is about your people. A high employee turnover is the most expensive thing you can have in your organization. And of course, I published a couple of articles on that. When you go on expert.nb-networks.com, you find articles you can put in your email address there, and then you get a weekly email. It's 100% content, ad-free guarantee, where you get free access to everything I published during that week. Of course, when you now say, hey, Niels, I have a couple of questions, but do you have time for me? Yes, I do. Of course, when you want to talk about training, speaking, coaching, consulting, or mentoring, or something long-term project, interim management, let me know as well. But if you want to talk about certain situations where you say, hey, I need to get something checked, I need to have an idea on this, let's just have a chat. Let's just have a virtual coffee. Although I don't drink coffee, I probably stick to lemonade or water or orange juice, whatever it is, depending on the time of day. We will have a chat. Just drop me an email, nb@nb-networks.com, and then we take it from there. And the most important aspect now is to apply what you learned in this podcast. Because when you do not apply what you just heard in this podcast, or even parts of it, the parts you need in your organization, if you do not apply what you heard and learned in your organization, you will not see the change that is obviously necessary. And the change that you want to see in your organization will only happen when someone takes action, and someone should probably be you. I wish you all the best implementing the steps in your organization. Always happy to help. Let me know and get in contact with me anytime. I now wish you all the best putting these steps into the real world in your organization. And for this week, there's only one thing for me left to say. Thank you very much for your time.